we see the council being divided, and we heard that it's divided over Ukraine. U.S. accuses Russia in disturbing the world order. Russia just yesterday accused the United States in trying to wreak havoc in the U.S. In the Russia-Ukraine relationship, and China actually insisted on quiet diplomacy. What do you make of it, and where is it all taking us?
Well, it's encouraging, that if you like, people are still shouting at each other rather than shooting at each other. Um, the fact that China is talking of quiet diplomacy rather than simply coming out, unconditionally for Russia shows that the Chinese are still, pursuing a relatively cautious approach to this, because, some people have suggested that, a complete breakdown in relations between Russia and the West would be so much in China's interest that they would want to really push this. But it seems that the Chinese, are worried about the implications for the world economy, apart from anything else, and for energy prices of a new war. And so, in fact, they do not want this to turn to violence. The things that the Russians and Americans have been saying to each other are, very familiar by now. One thing, though, I think is worth noting is, because it's not just what the Russians were saying at the UN Security Council, but Russian officials have been saying it, the Russian media have been saying it. Now, they are saying that Russia doesn't mean to invade Ukraine. Now, of course, one has to take this with considerable reservation. But on the other hand, after saying this so often, I think it will be pretty difficult for Russia, if you like, simply to invade Ukraine tomorrow or next week. It's also been widely remarked, and I've seen this, that there isn't the whipping up of the war fever in Russia that one might expect. And the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has actually asked the West to reduce its language and rhetoric about the threat of war, which he doesn't think is imminent either. So it would seem that, at least for the moment, Russia has been trying to bring various kinds of pressure to bear on the West, but it does not look as if, which a number of analysts were saying, that Russia was not serious about negotiations at all and was simply preparing an invasion. Because if that had been the case, Russia would have invaded already, and they haven't. So I think, there is still considerable room for diplomacy on both sides.
Russian president at the press conference with the Hungarian president just moments ago emphasized that Moscow didn't see its major concerns addressed in the response from Washington and from NATO to its suggestions about security, providing security guarantees to Russia. We know that U.S. said no to that, and you wrote in one of your op-eds, Russia demands are not final and not non-negotiable, but their initial bargaining positions. So if we're looking at the statements that the Russian president just made, and if we're looking at the general rhetoric around this issue, what do you think will follow? If Putin says that Moscow is not satisfied with the response, yet the official written response is not given, there is no deadline for that, what do you think will ensue from this?
Well, it's been suggested by various leading Russian commentators, sensible ones, like, for example, Dmitry Trenin, the head of the Carnegie Moscow Center, that already by getting America to engage in direct talks with Russia, in a new negotiating process, this is already a success for the Russian government, because it hasn't really happened for many, many years in this way. Russia has been fobbed off with meetings of the NATO-Russian Council, which everybody regarded as a joke, frankly. The other thing which has been to Russia's advantage is the restart of the Normandy process involving France and Germany, aimed at a solution of the Donbass conflict on the basis of the Minsk II agreements. because this has been a Russian demand, well, ever since 2015, that the Minsk II agreement should be implemented. But also, it's a long-standing goal of Russian policy to try to draw France and Germany into negotiations with Russia, and, if you like, to some extent, away from the United States. So these are, I mean, you could say that they're small and only symbolic gains, but nonetheless, they are certain real gains for Russia. But, I mean, as you say, or rather as Putin has said, obviously the West has not met Russia's key demands. And so I think we will have to watch for two things, really. One is what kinds of additional pressure Russia brings to bear, of course, above all on Ukraine. We've already seen one cyber attack. We could see more of that. We could see clashes in the Donbass. Secondly, whether there is any movement on the part of the United States and NATO towards compromise with Russia. It has been suggested, for example, including by some leading former US diplomats, that if NATO can't guarantee no membership for Ukraine, it would cost nothing, for example, to offer a moratorium on membership for 10 or 20 years, a delay. For the simple, it would cost nothing because nobody thinks that Ukraine is going to get into NATO in 10 or 20 years' time. And so, in a way, this is purely symbolic, but it would certainly give a certain appearance of success. And clearly, absolutely central now to this negotiating process is that both sides should be able to back down from their maximal positions without public humiliation. That is the very essence of diplomacy. Now, how far Putin and the Russian government want to humiliate the West, we don't know. I doubt it, rather, because there are concrete things they want. It does appear, I have to say, that there are people in America and in the US Congress who do want to humiliate Russia. And I think it's worth remembering, if the Kennedy administration had entered into the Cuban Missile talks with the firm desire to humiliate Khrushchev and the Soviet government, there is a very good chance that none of us would be alive today. Diplomacy involves compromise, and it involves building what have been called golden bridges for the other side, across which they can retreat, without loss of face.
Anatol, do you have hope for diplomacy on the American side, watching how the rhetoric is escalating? Because we're hearing, basically every day we're hearing about new sanctions, and it's all pretty strongly worded. Sanctions, personal sanctions against Vladimir Putin are not excluded, etc., etc. But basically every day there is a talk about new measures, new pressure points, etc., etc. Do you think this is helping?
No, I certainly don't. I mean, don't get me wrong. If Russia invades Ukraine, then very severe sanctions will have to be imposed, because this will clearly be, obviously, I mean, the invasion of a sovereign state, unprovoked by anything that Ukraine has been doing, and a gross breach of international law. But let us not forget that the costs for the West and Europe in particular, but also the international economy, will be very high. Firstly, short of a Russian invasion, I do not think that you will get the Europeans, and that means above all the Germans, but also all the other European countries that depend heavily on Russian gas imports. They will not agree to do terrible damage to their economies and their energy supplies, if in response to some, much lesser Russian action. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that while it may indeed be necessary to introduce, really full-scale sanctions, let's not forget that Russia is not only by far the biggest provider of gas to Europe, it is also the biggest supplier of grain to world markets. You know, if you destroy or badly damage people's ability to pay for Russian grain, you may well see a surge in international food prices. Now, that has implication for political stability in many parts of the world. You know, if you look at the origins of the Syrian civil war, for example, or the Arab Spring in food prices, and you know that could affect key US allies around the world. And then, of course, there is the fact that Russia provides is in fact virtually the only source of various kinds of raw material, like titanium. How are we, you know, going to be able to acquire those if we can't pay for them? Now, of course, once again, the result of all this, it won't be to lock Russia out of the world economy. It will be to lock Russia out of those parts of the world economy that the West controls. It won't lock Russia out of the Chinese-dominated world economy. So the result will be to lock Russia into economic partnership with China. And of course, that will be a tremendous boost for China's energy security, food security, and position in the world in general. Now, we may have to do that, but we most certainly should not do it in a light-hearted fashion.
Anatole, maybe you're able, in light of this all, explain the position of the British government. We just heard from the foreign minister that the values should prevail over the short-term economic interests. We also know that the call with Boris Johnson for Vladimir Putin was rescheduled several times this week. We also know that there should be a visit happening and the foreign minister should come to Moscow at some point. Very strong worried rhetoric coming from London as well. Where does Britain find itself in this cycle of confrontation, and what does future hold for this?
Well, first of all, when it comes to values, you know, when Russian and Ukrainian, and I stress Russian and Ukrainian, and of course Kazakh and others, oligarchs were plundering their countries, impoverishing their populations, reducing large parts of their populations to misery in the 1990s, and transferring the proceeds of that to London, and not only to London, of course, New York, Cyprus, but above all, I think, London. We didn't hear much about values from the British government then. We heard about light touch regulation. Translated into plain English, that is a license for money laundering. So let us not get too carried away with British values, I say, as a Brit. Secondly, I mean, what is Britain's position? I'm very sorry to have to say, I think Britain's position is to strike the loudest possible pose on the world stage. This is, of course, a long-standing British syndrome, you know, the post-imperial desire to play the role of a great power on the world stage. But it's role-playing, it's not genuine, you understand. But this, of course, has been strengthened by Brexit, because part of the whole rhetoric of Brexit leaving the European Union was that now Britain will be an independent great power again on the world stage. So now it has to do something to demonstrate this. But let us not forget, look, nobody wants to fight Russia in Ukraine. You know, nobody has the will or the troops to do that. But if you take Britain, and Britain, of course, has not said it will fight Russia. The most it said is that it will provide arms supplies. But Britain, as much as anybody else, could not fight Russia, even if it wanted to. The entire British army can now produce two brigades for war. It can generate others, but it would take months and months and a tremendous effort. The British army is not capable of fighting a major war. It proved that, by the way, in Afghanistan and Iraq. So once again, there is a tremendous element of theatricality about all this. I mean, on the part of the West in general, but perhaps, you know, since Britain strikes the most dramatic poses, the element of theatricality is the most evident in the British case.
And across the English Channel, we're seeing completely different sentiment, if you will. This is France, and President Macron just spoke on the phone with President Putin. There is supposed to be a meeting, and France seems to be working towards a peaceful resolution of this. And what do you think is driving France in this case? Is this actually the understanding of the danger of full-scale war in the middle of Europe? Is it like some kind of an economic, maybe economic interests on the French side? What do you predict there?
In the French case, it's not so much economic interest. France is not dependent on Russian gas. But there has always been a desire, going back to General de Gaulle, for France to play an independent role as a leader of Europe. And I think Macron sees a certain opportunity to do this. But also, of course, France was absolutely infuriated by AUKUS, the British, American, Australian agreement to scrap the French submarines for Australia and essentially order American and possibly British ones instead, which France took as a mortal insult, but also, of course, as a very serious economic blow to the French arms industry. So there is not much goodwill in Paris at the moment for either Washington or London. Now, that doesn't mean that France is going to side with Russia against the rest of NATO, but it does mean that France is prepared to, take make a stronger effort towards compromise. Also, France, like Germany, drew up and signed the Minsk II agreement of 2015, which laid down the basis for a peace settlement for the Donbass conflict. And the French government is well aware that it is principally the Ukrainians who have blocked the implementation of that agreement. And so France's prestige is to a certain extent involved in trying to push the Minsk II process, or the Normandy process, as it's also been called, forward. So here are some key differences. Also, of course, France regards, after America, perhaps, by far its most important international partner is Germany. And of course, the Germans are also very, very cautious about confrontation with Russia, not just because of the gas and because Germany has much bigger investments in Russia, but 3.7 million dead in the Second World War fighting the Soviet Union, about 1 million of whom, by the way, were killed in Ukraine. That will have a certain lasting effect on your attitudes to confrontation with Russia.